Okay, so I'm here with my dad, who is working in a organizational capacity in the nonprofit. What exactly is the group?
It's a Hiawatha Institute for Indigenous Knowledge.
Okay. What are the goals? What are you guys trying to get done?
We're trying to provide educational classes on a college level, as well as informative classes for the general population regarding Native issues.
What would one of those classes be like?
Well, the traditional classes would be based on a culture, trying to preserve the culture. The more current classes for the general public would be focused around things like the survivors of residential schools in Canada and the survivors of boarding schools in the U.S.
Can you tell me more about the residential schools and boarding schools?
They were both initiated by the governments, both Canada and the U.S., to adapt Native Indigenous children to the general population. In other words, trying to get them to succeed in this current environment by eliminating their cultural background and any ties or language to it. And what we're trying to do is educate the population in the fact that this is wrong and that we would like to have our language back. And a lot of those schools have cemeteries where the kids are buried, and some of them are marked and some of them aren't. And we would like to get those remains returned back to their communities.
How would you go about getting those returned to those communities?
There is current legislation in the U.S. where we can do that. There's funding available through the Department of Interior, and in Canada there are funds available as well. The only exception being is that the Canadian students that went to U.S. schools are not being searched for in the U.S. because they're not U.S. citizens, and the ones in the U.S. that went to Canadian boarding schools or residential schools are not being searched for because they're not Canadian citizens, so Canada won't search for them.
So, how are you hoping to get that addressed?
Through a greater degree of education and the presence of classes defining what happened at residential schools, the atrocities, and the boarding schools in the U.S., such as Carlisle, where remains are currently being remanded back to their original communities, but it took an act of Congress and federal funding for that to occur. In Canada, the same situation exists where the remains that are in the ground in Canada are being searched, and those remains are being sent back to the communities from which those children came from after they're identified. A lot of these burial sites are not identified, and the children that are in there's no record of who they are or where they came from. So it makes it very difficult. They have to go through the process of DNA identification. So generally speaking, being able to present this problem to the public through government funding, because the government's admitted that they've done something wrong, along with the churches, because the churches ran on both sides of the border. They ran the schools, and they didn't keep accurate records. So we're trying to resolve that issue, and return the children to their rightful communities.
So, do I understand correctly that because we are on the United States side of things, you want to connect to the groups that are active in Canada to have a higher degree of coordination?
Yes, we're actively trying to bring a group from Canada onto the American side to be identified as such, as far as being survivors of residential schools, so that they can establish themselves on the American side. This kind of situation doesn't exist yet, and there are a lot of communities along the Canadian-U.S. border that are in that same situation, that they can't search for their relatives that are in the U.S. because the U.S. won't search for them. Canada won't search for them, can't search for them in the U.S., and the same situation that exists in the opposite hand, where the kids that were from the U.S. can't be searched for in Canada because they're not Canadian citizens, and the U.S. doesn't have authorization to do that. We're trying to resolve that situation by bringing one of these groups in to get them identified on both sides of the border so that they can work both sides of the border at the same time.
How are you guys funded? How is that side of that organized?
Currently, because we don't have a group on the American side working to find these children, we're waiting. HIIK is working towards bringing a group in so that they can be identified on this side. HIIK would handle the educational component of it, as well as training personnel on how to identify and how to search for the missing. But to help establish that group as a legitimate entity on the American side, once we get that established, once we can establish that, we can apply for United States federal funding. And the same exists in Canada, where the groups over there, they already have Canadian funding, but they can't work in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Are there groups in the U.S., like the group that you're trying to bring into the U.S., that have the people and resources to identify the people in Canada, but can't right now because there isn't a group bringing them into Canada right now?
This is the problem. These groups don't, as far as I know, they don't exist because of the fact that on this side of the border, in order to start the search, you have to become recognized as a nonprofit organization or an organization as well. But they don't exist because the funding isn't there. The funding is kind of like a catch-22, where the funding occurs after you get your 501c3 or you get identified as a legitimate organization. There are currently no organizations like that other than the one operating at Carlisle in Pennsylvania at the present time.
Alrighty, how would you describe the organizational system of the group that you are in? How is that structured?
We have a board committee currently at 5 members. We are working on expanding that to 12 and possibly 18. And when we do that, we're going to include some of the people that are in the Canadian Residential School Survivors Group, so that they have a presence on this side and they get to learn how to start their own 501c3 and establish themselves as a legitimate group on this side of the border. Once we do that, we also have a standing order with Deb Hallen, who's the Secretary of the Department of Interior. We have a standing meeting, which the day has not been set yet, but she is aware of the fact that we're trying to do this, and when we get our, excuse the term, when we get our shit together, we will initiate a meeting with her, at which point we will ask for funding, which she has available to her, but we have to be able to prove to her that this is a legitimate organization, and that comes from being affiliated with HIIK, because we've been in existence since 2011.
How did HIIK start?
It started by the efforts of a few individuals who recognize the need for educating the general community or the general population, and to also help preserve indigenous cultural aspects that are not being taught in the U.S. right now.
So, if I interpret this correctly, your group's one of your largest obstacles to getting these remains identified and returned to their families is the way that operating in two different countries puts different funding and allowances of operating in front of you guys?
Yes, the procedures necessary in the U.S. don't quite mirror the procedures being used in Canada. In Canada, there's a requirement of 3 identifying methods, valid methods that have to be utilized in order to remove remains from a particular spot, of which one is ground penetrating radar, and currently there are very few Native people that are technically
Trained
effective to use that type of technology to locate them.
Mm-hmm.
And we have in our list of people, we have a technician who is experienced in that ground penetrating radar, both the interpretation, recording, and the final results. He's ex-military, and that tells you a lot right there.
What are you guys going to be doing specifically to enable the people in the Canadian organizations to be able to use that ground penetrating equipment effectively?
Like I said, we have an ex-military person who has extensive background in ground penetrating radar, and all of the methodology and recording instances there. We'll be training. We're going to probably set up a 3-man team training sessions here on the U.S. side to train both Canadian and U.S. groups to be able to do this. In the future, this will extend not only for boarding schools, but also for any missing or murdered Indigenous women and men across the country. In other words, they'll be searching on their own once they get through our class and sent out back to their communities.
So, in doing this, you would like to not only remedy the boarding school and what was the word? Residential school. Remedy that those remains and put those back where they should be, but also afterwards, hopefully equip other communities around the borders of both countries so that they can have more of their lost people returned?
Correct. That's what this will evolve into in the future, is searching for the missing, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
On what kind of scale would this operation eventually lead to? Or where are you scale-wise now, and where is the end goal?
At current, there are approximately 300 residential schools in Canada, with records indicating that there are between 30 and 40,000 children buried there. A lot unidentified, unmarked graves. But upon further investigation by the Native groups, Indigenous groups that are looking for these kids in these various locations, which is actually less than 10, they've come to the realization that there are possibly 70 to 80,000 missing kids that the Vatican has records of, but is unwilling to provide the records for. because they don't want to be identified as having committed mass genocide.
So out of that scale right now, what are the organizations currently working towards, like, finding and returning?
Less than 10 schools have been searched. 10 school properties have been searched, and they're not all searched 100% yet. But they've already found close to 500 remains. So that's telling you that there's a long way to go when you start looking at 80,000 kids.
Yeah, this has been very, very helpful and very informative. I hope that you guys can get everything organized and sorted together so that this can run smoother and get things done faster.
We're working on it. It's a collaborative effort, actually.